The legislation, the Higher Education Standards Framework, wellbeing and safety sits within the learning environment domain. And for many years, I actually was asked to report on this to the teams that were putting together re-registration documentation, but I never paid full attention to it. And so now it's very much part of I have all of them open on my tabs at all times. So as you can see in this screen, wellbeing and safety, it's very much about the actions you can take, your contacts, the things that you identified in your word cloud that would actually make you feel well and safe if you were a new student on a campus. Timely and accurate advice, what's available to you, the nature and the extent of the support services, and very much about, which we'll be talking about today, what you have available is informed by the needs of your student cohorts. And this comes through really clearly in many of the areas that we need to address in this space. A safe environment is promoted and fostered, and there's a critical incident policy. So for those of you who I know are on this call in the international education space, there's a lot of overlap here with the national code as well, in what you need to have available for your students, but not just having it available, having it accessible, and actually also having it communicated. And I know that that's one of the biggest issues that we face, is actually how we communicate wellbeing and safety. The student cafe that I helped facilitate at the conference last week, our table talked about communication the whole time. When students said, don't bother emailing us, we just won't read it. And so that opened up a whole conversation about, well, what is the best way to try and get your wellbeing and safety messages through to your students? So I'm sure we'll be able to chat about that later. So that's your section 2.3 of the Higher Education Standard Framework. Emma, next slide, please. So what the HES framework, and I love this wording, so I chose to use it in the presentation today. And actually, the framework contemplates the provider recognising it has a range of responsibilities, and in doing so, taking active responsibility for fostering an environment of wellbeing and safety for its students. Again, it aligns with most of the legislation that's around by using the word active responsibility, active monitoring, active review, active everything, like keep an eye on things. And what it looks like in this space is actually conducting effective risk assessments and implementing preventative controls for the risks identified. So again, that links back to your student cohorts. Where is your risk? Where is your risk in your student cohort on your campus? So conducting effective risk assessments and actively taking responsibility for that. Providing advice about actions to take, staff to contact and support services. So that very much led into the word cloud that we were talking about. Where is the information? Last year at the AIEC conference, we asked the students one thing: what could we have done for you that actually would have helped you when you arrived in Australia? These were international students. They said, we just wanted a cheat sheet. We wanted you to provide a cheat sheet of where we could go if we got lost. How do we get to campus? Who do we go to if we need help? So sometimes it can actually be a simplified response that actually meets this framework. You know, the students need to know if they've got personal circumstances are having an adverse effect on their education. I'm sure everyone who's linked in today is trying to actively respond and appropriately respond to students who are having difficulties, and certainly to get some strategies today on how to do that. Very much calls out your sexual violence, drug and alcohol abuse prevention programs. So particularly if you have a younger cohort of students, this would be very much part of what you're trying to achieve in preventative education. Providing support for affected students where needed. So that can be your support services, that can actually often land within your academic spaces and need to be referred across. So how do you provide your support for your affected students? How do you communicate it? And how is it actually structured in your policies and procedures so that everybody on your campus knows how to do that? And then having your systems and processes to respond to incidences and prevent recurrences. So again, might be first response, it might be your response to the incident. But what do you do from a review and monitoring perspective post-event? What have you learnt from it? How do you record what you've learnt from it? How does that make its way into your governance structures so that you've actually reported? If it's a critical incident, for example, you might have followed your policy and procedure to the letter of the law. It should actually include reporting back to your governance structure on what happened, and is there anything that we need to do from our learnings to improve our processes here based on what has just happened. Thanks, Emma. So these, the Wellbeing and Safety Guidance Note's fantastic for anybody who works in wellbeing and safety, because the text of guidance notes actually provide guidelines for you on what you're supposed to be looking at. So again, these are open on my desktop at all times. The way to do this is actually to have all of the things I've just spoken about. There's an expectation that you'll have an overarching framework of guiding policies and effective processes, and what they look like, you know, and it can also be your procedures, it can be your processes, it can be your registers. And the expectation is that there's been a corporate commitment to the development of these wellbeing and safety policies, procedures and processes. So from my view, what that means is actually a whole of institution approach. It's actually not good enough for actually just your student support team to understand this, because it may not play out just where your student support team sits in the campus. They also, again, presuppose that you identify your risks. So going back to their legislation, it's looking at your risk assessments, looking at your ongoing management of risk. In your governance structures, you would generally have a risk management committee of some sort who should be looking at your risk register, identifying the risks and actually taking the appropriate steps, again, with a student cohort focus. So everyone has different types of student cohorts and they may have particular needs, and the expectation is that you understand the needs of those particular student cohorts, and that your decision making in your campus is actually all about implementing effective mitigation and management strategies for those student cohorts. And, you know, an example of that could be you're aware that you have students who may have English language support needs. So what have you got in place there from an early intervention point of view to actually look at early assessment results? You know, are they coming to class? Have they done a writing evaluation so that you can put them into some academic language support or some English language support? So there's an expectation there that you actually know your student cohorts, and you actually put your support in place to cater for their needs, and have an ongoing evaluation of that in case you have a change of student cohort, which can easily happen in a campus too, particularly if you bring in new courses and new disciplines. So I thought what I'd take you through as we've been drafting some policies and procedures around student wellbeing and safety recently is just what we do at DVE when we're actually looking at how to actually draft our policies and procedures to meet legislative and regulatory requirements, but also with the nuance that you need as a campus to make these work for you. So we actually created a policy framework recently, and so each of the policies and procedures we've been writing have these elements in them. And what they enable from my own point of view is actually a whole of institution approach, which is so important. Everybody needs to be able to talk to your policies and procedures. They need to just understand, even if they don't remember the detail of your policy and procedure, that there is one. They need to actually understand maybe, oh, I do remember, I need to refer this here. And of course, if they don't stand alone, you've got your ongoing communication that sits alongside these policies and procedures. So I've just used a dummy student support policy and procedure just as an example here to give you a look at what it might look like under these particular headings. So it goes from very high level statements to actually the how of actually how you would implement what you're trying to achieve in your policy. You don't always have policies and procedures. That's an institution-based decision about whether you like to have them separate or whether you'd like to have them together. So I've used just a student support policy and procedure as an example. And this one, the high-level statement, is actually the policy and procedures designed to underpin effective student support as required by the mandated higher education standards. So you're calling that out right from the word go, that's what you're trying to achieve, and to appropriately put in responsibility and accountability. So that's your high level statement about what your policy is going to be about. The purpose is to provide the framework and actually make sure the framework reflects the principles that you've actually discussed when you're putting this policy and procedure together. The scope is who. So who does the policy and procedure apply to? Sometimes they can apply to prospective students, as well as enrolled students and staff members and members of the decision-making bodies who have the oversight and accountability. And then we move into the principles. So they're always they're the difficult ones to write. And you sort of need to know exactly where you're heading with the policy to be able to write your principles. So again, they're an intent, they're an overarching statement. So I've just chosen one principle that we've recently used in our student support policy and procedure that links to this presentation. And the principle was effective student support underpins a safe study environment and contributes to the health, safety and wellbeing of students. So the principle in our student support policy, this is one of them, that we want effective student support because it underpins a safe study environment.